May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, who crosses boundaries to claim us. Amen. You may be seated. The Marvel Cinematic Universe. It is this web of characters and stories and plot lines and sublines, and I can't keep up with all of it. I'm just going to confess to you here now. I can keep up with one storyline, and I try to follow it closely because A, it means that I can talk to my nieces and nephews about something that they're very engaged in, and B, I can follow along the storyline quite easily. I follow the Guardians of the Galaxy. I follow the Guardians of the Galaxy because they don't have all these complicated titles. Their movies are Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. I can keep the sequence. I don't have to remember, is that story come before this story? Where does it fit in? They tend to function by their own little storylines. Sometimes you see those characters in other stories, but they also have a great soundtrack. And so if you're close to my age, you'll appreciate the soundtrack, if nothing else, in the storyline. But I raise up this Guardians of the Galaxy because in movie 1, you get this slow progression. You meet Quill, and then you meet the other characters, and then you sort of go through getting the backstory and who they are. And that's all fine and good. But in Volume 2, they begin with this great big prolonged scene with rock blaring in the background, and they're doing all these things. They're making these jokes and lines back and forth, and you got to know sort of what's going on to enjoy it. Now, knowing that speed, that movement of things, that insider voice, I want us to jump to the Gospel of Mark. Because you see, whereas Luke and Matthew are going to take time, and they're going to tell you about genealogy, they're going to introduce you to one character at a time, one person at a time, and ease us into this good news story, Mark begins like Volume 2 of the Guardians of the Galaxy. It is fast-paced, it is action-going, it is moving. I mean, look at this. We've already had an exorcism today, and we're not yet out of chapter 1. We've already had Jesus come on the scene. He's called his disciples. He's been sent into the wilderness. He's been baptized. And now he's out there exorcising demons. And we're not even to the time of eating popcorn. I mean, folks, the Gospel of Mark is moving on. Now, what takes place in today's story, and it underlines the whole message of Mark's Gospel, is this sense of urgency. For Mark, there is no reason to be waiting around. The gospel message that Jesus has, his life, his ministry, and us hearing it, have to do with this sense of urgency, of moving along, of getting on about things, of not waiting, not dilly-dallying, not sitting back and having tea, but on about the business of doing the work he's been called to, as well as the work that we're called to. In the story of the demoniac man, the man that is possessed, and as we read Mark's Gospel, we shouldn't be surprised that we're going to see a lot of unclean spirits taking place there. We're going to see them show up at least 4 times for exorcisms. We're going to see unclean spirits in different places. And so just like if you watch the Guardians of the Galaxy, you've got all these different creatures showing up. It's sort of the same way. Just get used to it, buckle in, be ready for it, because that's part of the story also that Mark is telling. And to understand that piece, we've got to go back. No, I'm not talking about the Marvel Universe. I'm talking about the story of God's people. We've got to go back to that time when Moses and the tribes of Israel were walking around the desert. They're in the desert, and God is trying to teach them how to be God's people. Moses goes up the mountain to hear the instructions. He comes down. He has talked with God. He comes down to convey those things, those teachings. His face is glowing. And the people are a little freaked out about this. And so Moses begins wearing a veil so that people don't feel quite uncomfortable when he's talking about the presence of God. Eventually, they are given the instructions. Here is the covenant. Here is the Ark of the Covenant. Here is the lights that you put around it. Here is the tent that you construct around it. Here are the ways that you're going to know my presence in your community. And in all those instructions, we have this notion the presence of God being with the people, but yet separate from the people. If we go forward several generations, that gets transferred into the temple in Jerusalem. In the temple of Jerusalem, it is based on the purity, the holiness of God, and the uncleanness of this world. And if we looked at that Temple Mount, there is, in the very center of it, the Holy of Holies, the place where God's presence was thought to reside, the place where only the high priest would go after an elaborate series of purifications and rituals, after a series of being right and ready and good, once a year would enter into that inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies. And around that were different degrees of cleanliness. Only priests were in some sections. Only men were in some sections. Only purificated people were in some sections. The Gentiles were way out there. And so it's this idea that God is this pure, separate being, and we are this broken apart people that are out there, unclean, unworthy to be in God's presence. Jesus comes to upset that. Jesus comes to say that as God Emmanuel with you, I'm going to be with you everywhere. And here's one of the first challenges that he has. When he goes and encounters a man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, the first thing the Spirit says is, "What do you have to do with us?" In other words, it's an authority line. You don't belong here. Who makes you think that you're in charge in this place? If you are God, and the Spirit says he is, then you reside in that place that is set apart from us. You reside in that place that is holy and pure. You don't belong here. And Jesus, as he will do in many other times, asserts his authority to be everywhere. He is there with the unclean man. He is there with the little boy who is distraught. He is there with the woman by the well. He is there with all of his disciples. He is there all the time. If urgency is one theme of the Gospel of Mark, then God's persistent demand to be in the midst of the messiness of our lives is the other one. And this story of Jesus, his first miracle in the Gospel of Mark, going into this relationship, crossing that boundary, declaring his authority, is good news for us. How many times have we thought, well, there is my spiritual faith life, and then there's my other life? I encounter with you sometimes, I'll be honest, because sometimes we'll be talking at a party or something at the store, and something will slip out, and you'll say, "Oh, I probably shouldn't say that in front of my priest." And I'll say, well, actually, if we look at Mark's gospel, we shouldn't have those distinctions and lines. What Jesus' message is in this gospel is that I am going to be with you always. It's a message that we hear explained most prominently in the cross. In the pain and heartbreak, in betrayal and hurt, I am there also. There is no place, no boundary, no wall, no line that I will not, cannot cross to be there with you, to fight for you, to bring you back into healing and wholeness. And that's good news for us. There are times that we battle with the demons of addiction. There are times we deal with the battles of ego. There are times we deal with the demons of sacrifice that we think we're not right. And all those times, Jesus says, no. Those demons that you're fighting, those offenses that you have, that you think separate you from my love, I'm going to cross that line. And Jesus will, in the Gospel of Mark, continue with urgency to cross those lines, to be with you, to be with me. And we have but to recognize God's authority. The task we have is to move with urgency, to not put off till tomorrow. Well, I think tomorrow I'll deal with that demon that I've been wrestling with. Well, I think next spring I'll finally get around to having that in prayer. Well, I think 2025 looks pretty good for me to start dealing with my addiction issues. No. Jesus' Mark Gospel is going to tell us now, do it. Let God cross those lines into your heart, into your soul, into your family, into all aspects of your being, so that you may, like this demonic man, be relieved the pain and suffering that you have. Allow God to cross into those places that you think you should put off, those places that you think he doesn't belong. And open your heart, your mind, your spirit now to God's presence. You will see life. You will see joy. You will see God abiding in you forever and ever. Amen.